The smoke tasted like failure. And that's when a wagon rolled up, carrying the one person who could set my kitchen. And my life, right? And if that sounds dramatic, you should have seen the way the black cloud poured out of my stovepipe like a signal fire calling every raven in New Mexico, because I flung the door wide to save the curtains from catching, swore at the skillet because it deserved it, and admitted to the empty yard what I'd refused to confess to my own pride, that a man who could trail a 3-day scatter of cattle across basalt and brush apparently couldn't coax beans past raw or ruin without marching them straight into charcoal. The sun had only just shouldered itself over the Oregon mountains and laid long cold light across my yard, and the pan on the porch looked like a punishment, and I thought about coffee that bit like a rattler because I'd burned that too, and I was trying to decide between going hungry or chancing the biscuits that could split a shoe heel, when the slow jingle of harness and the dry rattle of wheels came up the track, and I turned, already forming some joke for Thomas Wilson about unexpected auditors from the territory's Bureau of Bad Cooking, only the joke died in my throat because he wasn't alone. Thomas swung down with a grin plump as a summer peach and said he'd smelled my breakfast halfway from town, which was a kindness because I knew he'd smelled my failure instead. And then he turned to offer a steadying hand to a young woman climbing from the wagon with the same certainty some people bring into church, the kind that makes you stand a little straighter without being told. The dress was simple blue, the bonnet practical, the boots dusted from travel, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the auburn hair the bonnet couldn't quite contain, or the green eyes that took in my porch, and the dead pan and the dog-eared broom in one sweep. It was the way those eyes measured the room and me the same way a good hand measures weather, without hurry and without apology, and I felt something in my shoulders unlock and something in my jaw lock up tight. Thomas said this was his niece, Tabitha Winters, straight from Boston by way of a disappointment that would be her story to share or not. And he said words like capable and cook, and I heard them. But what I felt was the thud of my own stubbornness meeting the harder fact of an empty stomach. I tried to muster the argument I'd been practicing since old Pete took himself and his cast-iron talent to a bigger spread, the one about a ranch not being suited to city women, and the work being hard and the days being long, and the comforts being few. But what came out instead was a half-hearted grumble about managing, and my belly chose that traitor's moment to object audibly, which pulled one corner of her mouth into a smile that wasn't cruel, just informative, as if to say reality had joined the conversation and would be handling rebuttals from now on. She stepped past Thomas, past my embarrassment, and into the kitchen as if she'd been invited by the room itself, glanced once at the scorched pots, once at the heap of flour that had given up on becoming biscuits, once at the stove sulking with low coals, and said, not unkindly but without room for argument, "Move over, I'll stir the pot." If pride were a horse, mine would have crow-hopped and thrown me into the trough. Yet I heard myself naming wages that were fair and quarters that were plain, and she answered, "Today." And that single word felt like someone had opened a window I didn't know was painted shut. Thomas promised to send her trunks after. I found a clean apron that had fallen behind a peg 2 administrations ago. And then I found myself in my own kitchen learning that heat is a language, and I'd never bothered to become literate. Because she set the fire not with force but with respect, and she cleared a space with an economy that embarrassed my habit of trying to conquer mess by moving it from one corner to the other, and she cracked eggs with a rhythm that sounded like competence. And when she reached for the spoon at the same moment I did, our hands touched, and the heat that jumped wasn't from the stove, and it wasn't from shame either. It was from something I hadn't felt in a long while and wasn't sure I trusted, though I didn't pull away. By the time Miguel wandered in with that grin that says, "Troubles become entertainment," the kitchen had stopped bristling and started breathing. And by the time Josiah drifted through on quiet boots, the room smelled less like surrender and more like breakfast. The kind of honest scent that can make a man forgive himself a little for what he doesn't know yet. And the way those two gathered near the table without being told was the way men gather when a bell rings. Not because they're hungry only, but because something orderly has announced itself, and order is a kind of mercy. I tried to stand like none of this impressed me. Tried to tell myself I was simply being practical. Tried to rest on the narrow fact that I'd offered employment, and she'd accepted. But the broader truth pressed in anyway, that my house had felt like a tool shed for a month, and with her sleeves rolled and her focus laid on the work like a blueprint, it had started to remember itself as a home. She took a hard look at the disaster I'd been calling a pantry, and said the word patience the way a schoolmarm says posture, not mean, just firm. And then she showed me how to let water do the simmering and air do the cooling, how to slice bacon thin enough to share its salt instead of clubbing you with it, how to keep flour honest with a light hand. And the more I watched, the less I wanted to make jokes, the more I wanted to learn. And somewhere in those first minutes, the line between humiliation and instruction blurred into something else, something like relief. If I learn to ask for help, maybe I learn to live again, not just ranch. And I didn't say that out loud because a man only admits one truth at a time if he wants to keep breathing steady. But I thought it and felt how it fit. When the plates hit the table and the coffee tasted like coffee instead of a burned apology, and the talk turned easy because good food makes room for it, she stood back a pace and watched us eat the way a blacksmith watches a shoe take to a hoof, and when my thanks tripped over my pride, she saved me from myself by saying what the kitchen had already said, that I'd been trying to conquer food like an enemy, which is a useful posture for a storm or a rustler and absolute foolishness for stew. And then she added, almost amused and almost kind, "Let me teach you." I looked at my hands, scarred from wire and rope and brush, and wondered how many years I'd spent using them to prove I could survive when I might have used them, with instruction, to build something that felt like living. She said today again without saying it, because she tied on that apron as if the job were already settled. And Thomas shook my hand with a satisfaction I'd seen before only when he'd closed a ledger square, and the smoke that had tasted like failure slid out the door and didn't come back. And I started to understand that the difference between a man and his habits can be the distance between an empty plate and a table laid for four. Lessons begin with bacon and pride cut thin, because that's what she said when she put the knife in my hand and showed me the angle. And I took the knife, and I let someone else's voice be the one in my kitchen for the first time since my mother died. And the day shifted a degree toward something I didn't have a word for yet, but planned to learn. I hired a cook and found a compass. And if that sounds like a line a man would polish for telling later, it isn't. It's the simple truth discovered in the rhythm of a first morning that didn't start with cursing, because she was up before the birds reminded the mesquite to smell like itself, and the stove's breath ran even because she'd banked the coals right, and she handed me a slab of bacon with 2 fingers placed where the blade should pass, and I moved slow the way she'd taught, thin enough for the heat to kiss each strip instead of wrestling it. And while I cut, she tuned the fire with the eye of someone who listens for things I only ever tried to force, and the room filled with a scent that reached back into my boyhood to a kitchen I remembered mostly as a place my mother knew how to make safe. The ranch breathed differently with that smell in its ribs, the way a horse lowers its head when it trusts the hand on the rein, and I stood there feeling ridiculous for how much difference seasoning and confidence can make, and grateful in a way that tightened my throat. And if I hovered, well, she called me on it with a glance that said I was welcome, to watch as long as I didn't pretend I wasn't watching. We fell into a banter I didn't know I'd missed, the kind of plain talk work demands when it's being done right, with Miguel drifting through to recount, at unhelpful length, my greatest disasters, like the day I set a wooden spoon alight because I thought flame respected panic, or the morning the biscuits rang against a plate like iron washers. And each story made her mouth tilt with amusement that never slid into meanness, which is rarer than rain in June, and in between the teasing she pointed to the back step and said we ought to put a small herb garden where the sun catches the wall without scorching it, rosemary if I could find it in town, and thyme if not, and I said yes too quickly, which told on me, and she let it. And neither of us fussed with the fact that accepting improvement can lay a hand on a man's pride and not harm it. The light came in sideways and struck loose strands of her hair, making copper out of auburn whether the day intended it or not. And there are things a man should keep to himself if he wants to keep the day simple. But I failed that lesson and looked too long, and she felt it the way a skittish colt feels the change in air when a hawk passes. And she turned and met my eyes with a steadiness that wasn't flirtation and wasn't offense, only the clear acknowledgement that two people aware of each other can still elect to be useful, which is a decision grown folks don't make often enough. And I nodded without meaning to, and she nodded back, and the moment folded into the work like a pinch of salt into the pot, dissolved and altering everything. When the bacon sang and the eggs came together with a patience that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with listening, the talk slipped its shallow clothes and found something that fit, because the kitchen, once it's fed you, will sometimes ask for a story as payment, and I gave it mine in the quiet way men do when a day has gone kindly, that I buried both parents before 20, that the ranch they left me tried to be a weight and learned to be an anchor, that the seasons had taught me the difference between stubborn and steady, and she listened while her hands worked and the pan hissed, and then she paid with her own truth, that Boston measured worth with ledgers unseen and smiles that cut, that a man with a desk and a bright future had called commitment a strategy, and her heart a provincial inconvenience, that she'd packed what pride would carry and come west with an uncle's kindness, and none of it was told to beg for pity. It was told the way you mark a trail so you can find your way back to yourself if the weather turns. We ate together with the men, because that was the way the morning arranged us, and Miguel told a joke that would have been better with coffee that didn't burn, and instead of telling him to get to it, I laughed. Because laughter takes up space, and the ranch had room for it again, and when the plates cleared, she tied back her sleeves and set about schooling me in the difference between heat that bludgeons and heat that coaxes, and I discovered with an amazement that made me feel both foolish and happy that even beans will talk if you stop talking over them, that the way a spoon moves through a pot can change the day it gives you back, that salt is a promise and pepper a warning, and that the lid is not a weapon, but a treaty. She walked the yard and measured a rectangle with her eye and her palm, and said, "This would be thyme, and this rosemary, and this a corner for sage, because stews respect it." And I said something about finding a fence board to keep the chickens from declaring their own culinary standards. And she laughed without looking up, which is a way of saying yes to a life without having to name it. And in that moment I understood a thing slow learners eventually reach, that kitchens and corrals both prefer quiet competence to show, and that I had hired a cook and found, to my surprise, a north. If I can be taught in a kitchen, maybe I can be taught in a heart. And I didn't say that out loud either. But the sentence walked around with me while we scrubbed counters and banked the fire for midday. And when she set a tin of flour back exactly where it should have lived all along, it felt like my chest had been in disarray the same way the pantry had. And we were, both of us, putting things to rights because work is the way some people pray. In the afternoon the talk thinned to the comfortable kind. Weather and fence lines and the way the far wind carries the smell of a storm hours before you see it. And she asked what I read when I used to read. And I admitted to Cooper and a little Dickens and anything with a river in it. And she spoke of Austin and libraries and gardens that belonged to the public, and how Boston's dangers wore gloves and smiles, and the territories wore spurs and dust, and which you preferred depended on whether you liked to see the edge coming. And I said the open suits me because I never was much good at guessing, and she said the open suits her because she is done pretending. Evening leaned its shoulder against the door frame and made the shadows tall, and the pot on the back burner muttered the way good food mutters when it's thinking about being better. And I reached for the spoon because a day of learning can trick a man into believing he deserves to steer, and she set her hand lightly on my wrist and said it again with a half-smile that meant more now than it had in the morning. "Move over." And the words weren't about the pot only. They were about the space between us where silence had started to simmer. And I felt both foolish and grateful as I stepped aside, because giving way is not surrender when you're making something together. It's how the flavors agree to be more than their parts. The house, which had been holding its breath for a month, exhaled. And the routine I'd called survival shifted toward refuge, and while the windows turned the last light into a soft kind of gold, she stirred with that slow circle that says patience is in charge. And I watched without pretending otherwise, and the cliff I'd been walking along for years moved a few feet back from my toes. A week later, the house exhales. Routine becomes refuge, but I didn't need a week to know the truth pressing at my ribs, which was that this woman from Boston had not only tamed my stove, she'd placed a map on my table and asked if I wanted to learn the way home. Some evenings she fed us with stew, other nights she fed me with Austin, and in the hush between those two kinds of hunger, I learned how a day can draw a map for a man who didn't know he was lost. Because dawn would find the coffee already breathing in the pot, and the kitchen warm with the low contentment of a properly banked fire. And I would come in from the pump with my sleeves wet and the yard's chill still fastened to my knuckles, to find flour dust turning the light gold around her wrists, while she worked dough with an attention that made talk unnecessary. And when I hovered, which I did more than a little because it felt like leaving a church too soon to walk away from that kind of quiet competence, she would angle a glance at me that said kindly and without apology that a man can either watch or help, but he ought not to orbit like a lost planet. And so I learned to choose a place beside her where my hands could do something useful. Her method, if you can call the patience of a river a method, asked me to stand still long enough to hear when the pan wanted heat and when it wanted restraint, to recognize that a boil is not a proof of life, but a threat muttered through bubbles, to accept that the lid is less a shield than a truce. And in that slow translation from brute force to listening, I saw myself reflected in more ways than cooking should allow. Because I had been a man who believed work meant leaning harder into the thing that resisted until it broke or yielded. And here I was learning to let the thing become itself with help rather than pressure, which is a lesson kitchens teach quickly and pride accepts slowly. After supper, when the plates were stacked and the fire had settled to a steady orange that threw the shape of the room against the walls like a memory, she would pull a book from the small stack Thomas had brought from town, most often Pride and Prejudice with its neat spine, and pages soft from being turned by someone who loved them, and she would sit near the hearth where the light was kindest, and read in a voice that managed to be both amused and tender, and I would take the mending chair opposite and pretend to fidget with a bridle in need of oil while listening to a world that was not mine. Make a kind of sense that felt unexpectedly familiar, because people are people whether they stand under chandeliers or under stars, and pride and misunderstanding throw the same long shadows across a parlor or a pasture. When she paused to sip water and asked what I'd read when I used to read, I admitted to Cooper and river stories, and anything with a boy who runs farther than he thinks he can, and I confessed I'd forgotten the simple pleasure of being read to since boyhood illnesses that took my mother from the room only long enough to fetch more broth. And she smiled with a softness that was not pity but recognition, and offered to keep reading on the nights my bones carried more dust than sense. And I told her I would not refuse what helped this house remember it was a home. There were moments when the lesson of patience turned suddenly into the lesson of nearness, such as the evening she reached for the spoon at the same time I did, and our fingers met along the worn wooden handle, and the spark that traveled through skin and bone felt nothing like the crackle of the stove. It felt like a truth naming itself without asking permission, and though both of us recovered into our tasks with the practiced steadiness of people who know the value of not hurrying what deserves time, neither of us pretended to forget the exact place our hands had learned one another's temperature. Later, when the pot did its quiet thinking and the pages rested, I asked about Boston with the kind of curiosity a plainsman reserves for oceans and ships and streets built without dust, and she sketched harbors that rattled with spars, concert halls where boughs rose and fell like wheat in a merciful wind, libraries so full of thought you could feel it press against your shoulders. And then, in a tone not bitter so much as precise, she drew the perils that travel in polite company. The bargains smiled into being while the ink dries elsewhere. The ways a woman can be measured like currency and then exchanged, and she said that out here the dangers wore their spurs openly, and the storms announced themselves honestly, which to her felt like a kind of respect. And I promised, not to her only, but to the part of myself that had learned to speak plainly around livestock, and then gone silent around people, that I would try to be as frank with my heart as I was with my hands. Out here, people say what they mean, she told me one night, while the embers settled like stars into their own sky, and I answered that I would learn to mean what I said even when the words felt like walking out without a coat, and she nodded as if we had struck a bargain that would not need witnesses, and for a while the days stacked cleanly, chores aligning with meals and meals aligning with pages and pages aligning with the kind of looks that build a bridge plank by plank without any fool rushing the span. And I thought perhaps this steady brightening might go on until the summer storms queued at the horizon and asked to rearrange our fences again. Dawn came after such a promise of an evening, only it did not arrive in the kitchen because I stepped through the doorway expecting the blessed smell of coffee, and found only the cold flat of an untouched stove and a silence that had nothing to do with peace. And my name went out of my mouth into that quiet without waiting for my permission, and the door to her small quarters stayed closed while I crossed the room and knocked in a way I hoped sounded like care and not panic. And from the other side came a voice that tried to be brisk and landed somewhere thin. "I'll be right out," which is what brave people say when they cannot be. And in that instant I felt how quickly a house that had learned to beat like a heart can falter when the person who winds its mornings is unwell. When she didn't light the stove, I feared the house had lost its heart. And that is not a sentiment I offer lightly because the ranch has taught me 1,000 times that buildings are wood and nails and men are habit-wrapped in dust. Yet I stepped into her doorway at her faint invitation and found the kind of heat no stove earns, a flush riding high on her cheeks, and a shine in her eyes that belonged to fever rather than anger or effort. And I felt my own temperature drop into the practical cold I save for floods and colic and wire failures, the one that moves hands while the mind catches up. And I told her gently, but in a tone used for colts, and men who mean to argue that she would go back to bed now, that I would manage the rest. And she tried to protest out of duty or habit until the protest turned into a cough that answered for both of us. I fetched the willow bark from the pantry, where she had tucked it with the quiet confidence of someone who trusts preparation more than luck, boiled water with suspicious humility from the stove that has seen me at my worst, and brewed the bitter help into a cup I held to her, with the same caution a man offers a frightened animal. And when she drank and her face softened with relief that had to fight its way past pain, I vowed, not in words, but in the simple stack of choices that make a vow real, that I would not burn the house down today, that I would make oatmeal for the crew and broth for her and keep the fire exactly where it belonged. The oatmeal came out edible because I treated the pot like a thing that could be trusted if I didn't bully it, and the men ate with the sort of restraint cowhands practice when they sense that joking would jar what needs attention, and I told Miguel how the day would run without saying why my voice was raw, and then I set to the business of turning yesterday's chicken into today's broth, with hands that shook in ways I would have hidden if the shaking hadn't been part of the work, because fear looks a lot like urgency when you give it a job. And once the broth whispered mercy from the ladle, I carried it into her room and found her drifting in and out of a shallow, restless sleep that made me want to shake the air until it gave her back, and I coaxed a few spoonfuls between her lips and thought that, if the territory could trade me one thing, it could trade me this fever for any storm it had in inventory. I saddled the fastest gelding with the efficiency of a man who has been told too many times that time is the difference between a story you tell and a hole you dig. And I rode for Doc Jenkins with the ground blurring under us, and the wind turning my worry into a kind of weapon I meant to throw at distance. And when I burst into his office, he rose with the resigned calm of someone who has never been surprised by a rancher arriving before noon. And he listened while I said the facts without the judgments. Summer fever in town, breathing a little labored, skin too hot, and he nodded, packed his bag with the tidy violence of a man who fixes things for a living, and kept my pace all the way back, though he has a decade and some on my legs. He examined her with hands that know where to ask, and ears that know what to hear, and told me the thing I needed and dreaded in the same breath, that it was early and treatable. That night often carries the worst of it, that someone must stay and keep watch because fever believes darkness gives it permission to climb, and the only answer that made sense came out of me before I had to go looking for it. I will. And he glanced up at that and did not argue, which is as close to a benediction as a practical man gives. Night arrived too soon and too slowly, and I started the vigil with the seriousness I reserve for storms I cannot outwork, laying cool cloths across her brow and temples, and the tender insides of her wrists, lifting water to her mouth in small sips, timed to the rise and fall of her breath, measuring out the tincture and the powder in the hours the doctor had set like mileposts, and in the restless troughs between, when the fever made her talk in half-thoughts and old names, she said, "Edward, please," with a pain woven through the syllables that had nothing to do with the temperature of her skin, and everything to do with the kind of hurt you can't lance. And I learned that loving someone might mean being present for the pain you didn't cause and can't remove. So I talked, not like a man who imagines his voice is medicine, but like a neighbor who knows that the sound of a familiar fence line holds a place when your own mind wants to wander into dark hollows, telling her about the small victories that build a season. A trough finally sealed against its petty leak, a calf found before coyotes taught us grief, the way Josiah's ankle had taken weight earlier than anyone predicted. And I told her how the flood 2 springs ago tried to take the north fence and failed because we worked as if the river could be persuaded by effort, and how the cottonwoods down by the bend keep standing because their roots remember what the soil forgets, and whenever her breathing hit that shallow, ragged rhythm the fever likes, I would bring the picture of the kitchen into my sentences. The scent of cinnamon. From the jar she labeled in careful letters. The tin of rosemary waiting for rain, the sound of her spoon against the pot, and slowly the line of her body learned to follow the story back toward calm, which is not a cure, but it is a path. If I keep the fire where it belongs, and if I keep the hours the doctor set, and if I keep talking her through the tangle, then dawn will pay me back. And I told myself that promise every time the clock pushed its minute hand with the lazy stubbornness of a mule that knows you'll wait because you must. And I discovered that faith, when it shows up for men like me, doesn't sound like hymns. It sounds like water in a cup, and cloth in a basin, and the whisper of a log settling deeper into coals. Just before midnight, when the lampwick needed trimming and my spine felt like a fence post after a windstorm, her hand came searching out of the fever's drift and found mine where it rested on the coverlet, and her fingers closed with a strength that surprised me, and she said, not in a dream voice but in the voice she used when giving an instruction she expected to be followed, "Don't leave." And I told her I would not, and I didn't. And the night, which had been holding its breath to see what kind of men we were, let it out a little. At first light her fever broke, and something inside me set, because I touched her forehead with a hand that had learned the map of that heat through the night and found coolness where fire had raged, and the relief that came through my chest did not simply loosen a tightness. It rearranged the furniture of my resolve, the way a hard rain after a month of dust does not just wet the earth, but changes its scent, its temper, its willingness to be worked. She woke with the soft bewilderment of someone returned from a long road she never meant to travel, and when her eyes focused on me and then on our hands still linked where the night had claimed them, She smiled in a way that carried both apology and gratitude, and called me a good nurse with a hoarse gentleness that embarrassed me more than praise for roping or riding ever had. So I joked about my broth to turn the light away, said it was barely fit for a camp dog and only saved from insult by a clean spoon. And she laughed because kindness insists on paying what it owes. And then the laugh curled into a cough that bent her like a reed, and I promised a day of rest with a seriousness that allowed no gallantry, because there are oaths a man makes with his mouth, and there are oaths his back makes by the way it squares itself, and this was the latter. She dozed and woke like a shore receiving small waves, and each time her eyes found me in the chair by the bed, she seemed to check a ledger she had started in the dark and find it still balanced. And near noon, when the worst had eased and she could sit up against pillows arranged with more care than I knew I possessed, she told me I underestimate myself, that while I might prefer to speak of broth and spoons, I had kept her alive with the stubbornness of attention. And I heard those words with my ears and somewhere deeper besides, because they reached into the part of me that had spent years answering need with labor and never with presence. And I understood her praise not only as gratitude but as permission, perhaps even as an instruction, to hope for more than the truce I had made with solitude. I brought her willow bark at the hours the doctor had marked, and when she wanted to be in the kitchen, though she did not yet have the legs for standing, I carried a chair to the doorway where the warmth reached without the effort, and she taught from that little throne with a composure that made convalescence look like a calling, telling me that beans whisper when they are ready and shout when they are wronged, that patience is not a delay but an ingredient, that a man who listens to simmer and scent can spare himself 1,000 scorch marks. And I believed her not because the words were polished, but because the room changed its posture around her voice. I learned to stir with the weight of the spoon instead of the weight of my arm, to salt with a memory of yesterday's broth and not with the fear of tomorrow's complaints, to watch the steam the way a drover watches the horizon for dust that means movement. And in the small successes of that afternoon, spoon scraping the right song from the bottom of the pot, onions surrendering sweetness without burning, a loaf set to rise under a clean cloth like a secret told to someone worthy, I felt a steadiness settle into me that work in pasture rarely grants, because the land is honest, but it is not intimate, and this, with her instruction shaping the heat, was intimacy of a sort a man can practice without trembling. When she grew tired and the color went from her lips, I lifted the pot, crossed the room in 2 strides to fetch her water, tucked the quilt higher, and spoke aloud the first honest admission I had let out of the pen where I kept such animals, that I needed her, and not just the meals or the order she coaxed from my kitchen, but the way her presence made the house answer its name, and the way my own thoughts settled when measured against her plain regard. She looked at me in the long, slow way a horse will look across a gate to decide whether a hand has ever lied, and after the look had finished its work, she nodded once. Not a dramatic thing, just a steadying, as if we had both agreed that a truth spoken does not need decoration. The day slowed its pulse, and the house, which had kept time with the fever all night, began to match the old rhythm of chores and twilight. I set dishes in their places with the care of returning lost tools to a friend, and I told her the promise I meant to keep until my hands were of no further use, that I would stand where she could see me even when she could not stand, that I would be the fixed point in the room when whether of sky or illness or rumor, tried to move the whole map beneath us, and she said nothing for a moment because some promises are too large to be handled immediately. Then she reached with that newly steady hand and touched my forearm the way you touch a post you mean to build on, and said only that rest would be wise if I planned to make good on anything tomorrow. We slept as people sleep after a night spent bargaining with heat, a sleep without dreams, because reality had demanded all of them, and when morning walked up the porch steps carrying bells and sunlight, she stood in the doorway pale but straight, chin stubborn and eyes amused at my frown, and said she felt strong enough to sit in a pew and hear a sermon that would almost certainly be shorter than the one I'd be tempted to preach if I insisted she stay home. I measured pride against prudence and decided that the territory's version of healing includes letting the town see you upright. So I hitched the wagon with more care than swagger and helped her climb as if the act were part of the cure. The road into Las Cruces looked gentler than it had the week before, perhaps because the air had been washed by a night of worry and a dawn of reprieve, and perhaps because every mesquite and adobe takes a different color when gratitude stings behind your eyes. The churchyard filled like a basin, families pouring in from arroyos and side streets, and we walked among them with the quiet complication of two people who have shared a long night and not yet decided what to name the thing forged there. The bell called, the door opened, the pews took us, the familiar faces nodded, the hymns rose with the kind of harmony frontier choirs make by agreeing on an intention, even if the notes don't all sign the same ledger. And when we stepped back out under a sky that had cleared its conscience, the past arrived in polished boots and a suit that seemed to consider travel a personal insult, and the expression on his face had the shine of a knife just taken from oil. He called our picnic rustic, and my cook absurd. I called him wrong, though I did it with the steadiness a man saves for mean cattle and wet rocks, because the town green had arranged itself into a small version of the world worth defending. Tables bowed with casseroles and cornbread, quilts spread like flags of truce, children running their figure eights between skirts and bootlegs, while the band tried to remember a waltz only two of them actually knew. And in that humane disorder, Tabitha bloomed in a way that made me understand the word in its proper sense, not the fragile unfurling of a hothouse flower, but the durable opening of a plant that knows wind, eyes bright with the attention of women who had decided in an hour she was worth their recipes, laughter easy not because she was showing off but because she was at rest, and I stood just behind her shoulder the way a porch stands behind a door, present without blocking the view. The gentleman introduced himself with the theatrical politeness of a man accustomed to rooms that bow when he enters. Edward Blackwell by name, though the name needed no saying, because Boston is its own kind of dust, and it travels farther than the wind that carries ours. His suit held its crease like a grudge. His hat brim was the exact angle of his judgment, and his smile was cold enough to set milk. I made a point of meeting his eye, of offering my hand with the weight of my work behind it, and of using my own name first, because a man who owns his ground gives other men less room to pretend they own him. He announced, in a voice designed to carry over both fiddles and gossip, that he had come to bring Tabitha back to Boston where she belonged, where comforts outnumbered chores and opportunities did not involve the indignity of a cook stove, and she said no with a calm the territory recognizes as the kind that keeps roofs on during wind, and the word lay between them like a line burned into brand new cedar, straight and not to be stepped over. He tried again, the way men try when they have only ever learned persistence as a synonym for entitlement, explaining with the airy patience of instruction that cooking was beneath her station, that work which feeds people is domestic drudgery, and she answered in the clear tone she uses when naming ingredients and principles alike, that any work that warms bodies and steadies souls outranks ledger juggling that fattens pride while thinning conscience. And the women within earshot made the small collective sound that says a truth has knocked into place like a well-cut mortise, and the men adjusted their hats because sometimes that is how agreement is registered. At this, the gentleman's gentility cracked hairline first and then deeper, and he reached for the oldest weapon in circles that rely on polish to hide blunt force. Implication, letting the syllables of her name drag near the suggestion that her employment under my roof had become something else. And the way the air shifted around us told me the town had heard the slight before it finished escaping his mouth, and I stepped in as a matter of sanitation, not show, using my body and my voice together, which is how a man builds a fence in a hurry, saying that Miss Winters's name was not a surface to be walked on by travel-dirty boots, that the line she had drawn would hold, and that if Boston wanted a duel, it could have one in the open ledger of our community. Not with pistols at dawn, but with the witnessed truth of who said what, and who fed whom. He laughed then, a sound too thin for the shade we were standing in, and called the picnic rustic as if the word were a stain he could wipe from his sleeve, and called my hiring her absurd as if competence were a kind of rudeness where he came from, and I felt the slow heat I reserve for branding season rise in me, the patient anger that does not need volume to be strong. The sheriff's eyes, steady and familiar, rested on us from the edge of the green, and I could feel half the town recalculating what it means to belong. And in that recalculation, Tabitha stood taller, not because she had to resist, but because resistance is easier when you are being held up by the place you've chosen, and that has chosen you back. If law won't protect dignity, I will, with mine. And I did not say that heroically because I have had enough of words dressed up for Sundays. I said it the way you say woe to a horse about to step into a hole. And I held his gaze long enough for the message to land that there would be no more talk like that while I drew breath near her. The picnic found its voice again because communities prefer songs to speeches. And we moved through the remainder of the afternoon with the deliberate cheerfulness of people refusing to let a fly spoil the stew. And if my shadow stayed close to hers, it was not because I thought she needed a guard so much as because some vows are kept before they are spoken. When the sun leaned toward the hills and the fiddles surrendered to children's yawns, the gentleman came near once more and hissed in a register meant for me alone that this was not over, that the territory's thin customs could not shelter what he meant to reclaim, and he rode for town in a posture that tried to make retreat look like strategy, and the dust his horse lifted tasted like the start of something I had no intention of letting finish on his terms. We cleaned up paper plates and good china, because in Las Cruces both attend the same parties, and the women pressed extra slices of pie into Tabitha's hands, as if sugar could weigh down slander's wings. And the men who knew how a rumor travels faster than a storm glanced toward Main Street with expressions like weather reports, and the sky went purple. In that way we all forgive it for, because it is beautiful even when it means night is coming. Night gathered rumors the way dry grass gathers sparks, and the wind from the saloon carried snatches of talk that had learned to walk on their hind legs, and I felt the house brace itself when we crossed the threshold, the way timber braces when it hears a far-off train, and I banked the fire and checked the latch and poured water, and tried to make ordinary gestures into wards against what the dark sometimes chooses to carry. We were sitting in the kitchen with a lamp turned low so the insects wouldn't make a case for invasion when I heard a horse take the porch steps, slow enough to be a friend or news. And Thomas Wilson's voice came through the door with a weight that emptied my lungs of any hope for a quiet night, because men who joke in daylight do not joke after dark unless they are foolish, and Thomas is never foolish. He challenged me to a century-old ghost, a duel over a woman who wasn't property, and the absurdity of it would have been laughable if it hadn't ridden up my porch in Thomas Wilson's voice after dark, because Thomas does not bring foolishness to a man's door at night unless there's danger wearing its Sunday coat and asking to be taken seriously. He stood just inside my threshold with his hat crushed in his hands, and the lamplight making worry out of every crease in his round face. And he said that Blackwell had been drinking Pride like whiskey all afternoon and paying for it with rumor, that the saloon walls had heard my name, and Tabitha's in a sentence not fit to be repeated by anyone who had ever loved a mother, and that somewhere between his third insult and his fourth complaint about dust, he had decided to recall a code that belongs in stories about pistols at dawn, and carried it into a town that prefers the clean arithmetic of daylight. And he had told the room that if I did not release her, a word he chose like a banker chooses a clause that keeps him dry when the river rises, I could meet him with weapons that do not belong to civilized mouths. I felt a heat rise in me that did not know where to sit, the kind that a younger man mistakes for permission to swing, and I mastered it not because I am better than I was at 25, But because I have learned that fury misapplied is simply the work you have to redo tomorrow after apologizing to everyone who watched you fail, and I told Thomas, in the tone I keep for frightened horses and dangerous men, that there would be no duels where I breathe, not while truth can still be shown in public, and that if Boston wanted a spectacle, it had chosen the wrong valley, because we keep our reckonings with witnesses and ledgers, not smoke at sunrise. I could have kept it from her for a night and a morning and called that protection, but secrecy is a cousin of the very slander I meant to stamp out. So I told Tabitha in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and the fire doing its best to look like comfort, and I watched her face move through anger into something harder and calmer, the expression of a woman who knows her name is not a hat someone else gets to wear, and she said, with the quiet that carries farther than shouting, that she would come with me to face what had been said, because it was her fight as well as mine, and her reputation was not a parcel to be shipped east or guarded by proxy. I asked her to let me speak first, not because I feared her voice, but because I knew Blackwell would interpret any silence as leverage, and I wanted to take that from him with the only coin a man like him respects, a steady male voice standing between his words and their target. She agreed with her jaw set in a stubborn line the territory recognizes, the one that keeps roofs attached and babies alive. And we slept as much as people sleep when the night is full of unwelcome guests that have come to sit on your chest and whisper scenarios. At first light, the air felt clean in our lungs because the body insists on breathing even when the mind is drafting speeches. And we rode into town with our shadows long, and our silence not unfriendly. And we turned our horses at the hotel because men like Blackwell prefer clean sheets, even when their mouths are dirty. And Mrs. Delaney, who hears everything and reports only what is useful, looked at us with the satisfaction of a woman who has spent the last hour reclaiming dignity from a guest's complaints and told us he had checked out before the rooster knew enough to crow, muttering something about barbarians and the impossibility of civil discourse west of the Mississippi, which is the kind of line men practice in mirrors when they believe the world is a stage and the audience paid too much for their tickets. It should have been a relief, and it was. In the small way, a single cloud moving off a sunburn is relief. But it was also the kind of absence that promises a different kind of presence later, because men who believe they're owed do not become better when they flee. They become cunning. And I said aloud what I felt in my bones, that he was changing tactics, and the promise I made to myself was simple and heavy, that so would we. We were still standing under the hotel's awning where the morning had not yet had a chance to be hot when Thomas came hustling across the street, as if urgency had made a messenger out of him against his will. A square envelope held between thumb and forefinger as if it contained a stain. The paper thicker than any bill that ever crossed my desk. The seal as fussy as a banker's excuse. And when he said, "From Edward," he managed to make the name sound like a word a decent mouth ought to wash out. Tabitha took it with a steadiness that convinced me courage can be taught, and inherited both. Broke the seal carefully because even when you expect poison, you don't spill it on the floor if the children might walk through later. And I watched the color move in her face the way a storm wind moves over a wheat field. Not dramatic, just decisive. She handed it to me halfway down the first page with an expression that combined disgust and fatigue in equal measure. The look of a woman who has had enough of having her life narrated by someone who confuses possession with care. And I read sentences that pretended to clarify and managed only to threaten politely. Words about informing Professor Winters of his daughter's unfortunate circumstances, about my influence, about her confusion. And I understood, in a way that made the noon sun feel colder, that he had decided to aim where he believed she was unguarded, at the father whose love might be leveraged into leash and collar if the facts were arranged with sufficient malice and charm. He's changing tactics. So will we, I said, and it was not a boast or a challenge, only a plan dressed in plain cloth, because I have learned that when a man begins to fight with paper and whispering, You do not bring a gun to the parlor. You bring light and witnesses and the kind of honesty that makes slander look like a child's game." Thomas squeezed my shoulder with the brief affection of an uncle who knows when to leave strong people alone with their choices. And he stepped back toward the street with a promise to keep his ear in the right corners and his mouth where it could do good. And I turned to Tabitha and found her reading the last line again, as if it might change if she stared hard enough. And then she folded the letter carefully, as if to put it away, not from cowardice, but from a desire to file it under answer later, rather than let it live in the air between us. The town moved around us the way towns do when they refuse to let gossip be the only sound, and the bells somewhere toward the church struck the hour with an innocent certainty that made me smile despite myself. And we walked to the wagon with the letter heavy in her pocket and the plan, unspoken but agreed, heavier in mine. He couldn't move her heart, so he aimed at her father's. And there is a special cowardice in that geometry, a preference for shooting around corners instead of speaking into a person's eyes, because the letter in my hand wore all the adornments of concern and none of its obligations, and it painted me with the kind of careful strokes a banker uses when he intends to foreclose and would like to be thanked for the courtesy, and it framed Tabitha as lost in a wilderness of my making, as if geography could swallow a will like hers without choking, and it promised to inform Professor Winters, in words wrapped in velvet so the knife would slip in without anyone noticing until the blood had already soaked the coat. We did not let it sit long enough to grow teeth. She asked for paper and ink, with a voice that had recovered its steadiness during harder nights than this, and she set herself at the table that had hosted more honest meals in 2 weeks than Boston had served her in 2 years, and began to write the way she cooks, with intention and timing and a refusal to oversalt the truth, telling her father plainly where she stood and why, offering him not defense but a window. And then, while the pen still warmed her fingers, she added an invitation that was not a flourish but a bridge, asking him to come west and see the life she was making with his own scholar's eyes, to measure dust against dignity and heat against freedom, to meet the men who worked beside her and the women who had already made room for her in their recipes and their prayers. The letter took its shape in an afternoon that allowed no interruptions beyond the practical: a kettle boiled for sealing, a biscuit lifted to keep reason from becoming faint, and when she laid the pages aside to dry, we both stood over them like new parents trying not to hover, and I found myself saying aloud an idea that had been walking up and down my spine since she began the first line, that we could do more than send words toward Boston. We could invite Boston, or rather the part of it that mattered, to walk toward us, and that Professor Winters might prefer the evidence of his own senses to any report, mine or Blackwell's, and that I would ride to Santa Fe myself to fetch him if he said yes, because a man's welcome begins before he steps off the coach, if you mean it. She looked at me then with something like wonder and something like relief, as if I had moved a mountain with a shovel and a promise, and she reached across the space between us and put her fingertips briefly against my wrist in thanks, which told me more about her trust than an hour's speech could have. And she said that perhaps after all the years he had given to books and halls and debates, her father might welcome a new kind of argument, the one a horizon makes. We sealed her letter and addressed it with care because the post is a kind of river, and you do not throw a thing you love into a river without giving the current every advantage. And then, as the wax cooled and the afternoon stretched like a cat in a patch of sunlight, we hitched up for the ride home with a sense of work accomplished that I would like to bottle for the leaner days. And out on the road where the mesquite throws its sparse shade not where you wish, but where it decides, the conversation, loosened by decision, curled toward lighter edges and then back to the heart without our pushing, and she asked why I had hired her so quickly when I had spoken so stoutly against a city woman running a ranch kitchen. And I answered with the honesty you give someone who has already seen you at your most inept. That hunger had argued the case better than I ever could and won the first vote on the promise of unburned food. And then, because the road was empty and the sky had arranged privacy out of light, I confessed the rest, that when she stepped down from that wagon in a blue dress that had to work for a living and looked at my ruined breakfast with a clear eye that judged the problem and not the man, I felt something align in me that had been out of true since the year grief moved into my house. And I said that if the food opened the door, her eyes convinced me the house might like who it let in. We both almost said the words that stand just over that line between truth and risk, the words that turn a porch into a vow. But fate is a cattleman with a loud voice and a bad sense of timing, and Miguel came pounding down the yard the moment our wheels hit the ranch road with a face full of dust and worry, shouting about Josiah on the storage shed and a bad step and a leg that had folded wrong, and the kitchen that had been set to receive a gentle evening became a clinic again in the space of 2 breaths. We slid from the wagon without ceremony and ran the way people run when the body column has taken a casualty. And we found him on the bunkhouse cot with his jaw tight enough to crack pecans, and his ankle beginning to bloom in colors the body uses for cursing, and everything we had meant to say put on its coat and waited in the corner while we set about the work that has to happen before talk can count for anything. Cutting bandages from old sheets and boiling them in the big pot, splinting with laths and patience and a prayer that had no words, keeping his mind busy with questions about anything other than pain. And in those hours, the letter to Boston began its own journey along the post road, a slip of paper tucked into a leather bag carried by a man who does not know he is part of a family choosing its next shape. Crisis first. Confession later, I told myself. Not as an excuse, but as a hierarchy of care. And when Josiah finally slept through the worst waves and the house remembered how to breathe around him, the moon had already stepped over the ridge, and the coyotes were tuning their voices for the midnight service. We banked the stove and put the boiled bandages we did not use into a tin against whatever the next day thought it would bring, and we stood in the kitchen in that cocoon of clean linen and steam and quiet that follows a hard hour done right, and we let our eyes tell the truth we had postponed without losing, that the words would still be there in the morning because we had earned them by earning the morning itself. Out on the road beyond town, the mail carrier shifted in his saddle, and the leather pouch knocked against his hip like a metronome measuring the distance between a father and a daughter. And I thought about how fate travels on hooves and wheels, and sometimes on courage, and I decided that while we waited, we would keep building the kind of life that does not need to explain itself. While we splinted an ankle and boiled bandages, the post road started carrying fate east. Peace returned, and in it, I learned to bake biscuits that didn't break teeth, which is another way of saying the ranch remembered its rhythm and let me join the beat without tripping over my own feet, because the herds took the rein like a benediction and bellied up on new grass while thunderheads walked the horizon and kept their promises. And in the kitchen, her lessons turned into a soft choreography. We both pretended not to notice. A passing of spoons and knives and bowls that looked like efficiency to anyone else and felt like a conversation to me. Flour turning our hands the same color for once, steam writing its quiet essays on the window panes, our shoulders finding the right nearness at the stove, as if the room itself had opinions about how close 2 people ought to stand when they mean to build something that lasts. I watched her demonstrate patience the way a river does, without lecturing, and found my own hands learning how to listen to dough with more humility than I had given most men. And when the biscuits finally lifted and stayed light instead of punishing, the crew cheered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for rain and payday. And I kept my grin to myself, because some victories you honor by not crowing. In those long gold evenings after the work went quiet, I would hover at the threshold of saying something worth saying, and then busy myself with wiping a clean counter as if it required a second polishing, until one night my caution tripped on its own feet, and I blurted, "I'll always need you," out of nowhere and everywhere at once, and the words landed between us like a saddle set carefully on a green colt, waiting to see if it fits. And she turned to me with that particular stillness she uses when the next choice matters and said, "Will you?" Not as a challenge, but as an instruction to think before you claim. And I felt the truth pile up behind my teeth, struggling for an orderly exit, while pride fumbled the latch. And before I could either step forward or run, a knock at the door saved me from my own cowardice and made me grateful to a piece of wood for interrupting a man at the very moment he might have made or ruined his own life. Thomas stood there with a look that always means news he has been impatient to set down, and he came in with his hat already off and handed Tabitha a letter addressed in a hand, so careful it could only belong to a man who lives among books. And we listened to the paper before she even broke the seal, because expectation has a sound of its own. "Professor Winters will come," the letter said in its own polite way. And not just come. He would come trusting her judgment over gossip, eager to meet the honorable employer whose name had reached him ahead of us, and eager to see for himself the life she had chosen instead of the one chosen for her. She pressed the pages to her chest for one breath, and then read aloud with a steadiness even joy couldn't rattle. And when she reached the line where her father said he was proud of the woman who could pick up a new world with both hands and set it down where she wanted it, the kitchen grew larger by a foot in every direction, as if the house itself approved. We planned a guest room that didn't yet know it was a promise, stripping the little spare space down to boards and building it back with clean curtains she sewed at night, and a quilt the women in town started piecing the moment they heard the words, "Her father's coming," because nothing travels faster on the frontier than a good reason to help. And I set shelves and planned edges and rubbed oil into wood until it remembered it could shine. We talked about what a welcome needs to say: home, not hotel, belonging, not visit. And she tucked a book or two she thought he'd like beside a simple wash basin. And the whole arrangement felt like a question to which we already knew the answer. When business took me into town for nails and salt and a tub that didn't leak, I found myself planted at Mackenzie's jeweler's window like a man examining weather through glass, studying the modest rings he keeps for occasions a town sums itself by. And there I stood too long until Sheriff Donovan drifted into my reflection with the easy gravity of a man who has seen most storms and forgotten none. And he said I looked like a fellow trying to decide whether to swim across a river or build a bridge, and that a bridge lasts longer if you set the first post before flood season. He didn't say buy the ring, but he also didn't leave until he had nudged me through Mackenzie's door with a hand to my shoulder that was as much benediction as shove, and I found myself inside describing a woman to a man who sells symbols, asking for simple and strong rather than loud and temporary. And the jeweler smiled because every decent craftsman prefers a clear brief. Ask only when you can protect what you're asking for, I reminded myself while Mackenzie laid out velvet squares the color of old night, and I chose the band that looked like it had been thinking of us a long time. A clean gold circle with a single stone set low enough that kitchen work would not punish it, and yet bright enough that light would have to admit its presence. I paid with hands that trembled more than they had at any branding fire, and when he snapped the little velvet lid shut, the sound felt like a door closing behind me on a room I never meant to leave again, and I slid the box into my coat with the same care I give a newborn calf. Ridiculous and correct. Back at the ranch, with the sun loosening its hold on the day, I packed for Santa Fe as if the road itself required arguments, tucking clean shirts and rope and good manners into a bag that had seen too many practical trips to believe this one wasn't different. And then I took a long, quiet moment in the barn that smelled of hay and horse and old prayers. And I set the velvet box into my saddlebag, where it settled like a heartbeat, not heavy but alive, telling on me every time I shifted my weight. I did not open it. There's a time for looking and a time for carrying. I could face rustlers and flash floods. Asking a scholar for his daughter shook me worse, and the admission tasted like chewing a nail. But there it was all the same as I rode into Santa Fe with dust in my throat, and the plaza ringing with the usual argument between wheels and hooves and voices, and found a spot near the coach office where I could watch without wearing a hole in the bricks. The stage rolled in late, as stages like to do when a man has stakes tied to its back. And when the door swung wide and passengers spilled into light, Professor Jonathan Winters stepped down last, tall and thinner than a man who lifts things for a living, with an expression that explained Tabitha better than any letter could, keen eyes cataloging, a mouth that knew how to be kind without offering what it couldn't keep, a posture that said courtesy need not be weakness. We shook hands and found each other's weight, and I got his trunk to a decent hotel where the beds don't complain, and dinner tastes like someone cared a little, and over that meal we began the polite work of measurement, him testing my edges with questions that sounded like conversation and felt like a map being drawn. The territory, its law and its lack, cattle markets and the arithmetic of water, the community at Las Cruces, and the way people stitch themselves into something stronger than what any one of them can lift alone. I answered without adding shine, and when the plates cleared and coffee arrived with the kind of sugar you have to knock out of a jar, he leaned back and folded his hands like a professor about to set the real problem on the slate and asked, "What is it you love about my daughter?" And the room turned quiet in the way rooms do when they hope a man will choose to be exact. "Everything that makes everyone around her better," I said, and if it came out faster than I intended, it was only because I had carried the sentence a long way, and I meant it across particulars. Her kindness that does not confuse help with permission, her strength that refuses to borrow hardness from cruelty, the way she meets a day with sleeves already rolled and lets purpose be its own ornament, the intelligence that listens first and speaks last, the steadiness that turns fear into timing, the humor that takes the ache out of hard things without making light of them, the way she cooks and reads and looks at a room until it tells the truth about itself. I said she makes the house a home and the men better men, and me most of all, because she asks without asking, and I told him if I could promise her anything beyond love it would be partnership in all weather, work shared, decisions accounted for, a life built hand over hand until the work's evidence is everywhere you look. I asked his blessing then, not because I believed it would substitute for hers, but because love travels on honest paths, and I wanted mine to arrive with witnesses. And he smiled with a recognition that made the table between us feel smaller, and said he had suspected as much since the first letter where her sentences changed pronouns from I to we, and that my asking told him the part he needed to know most, that pride hadn't made me deaf. He granted it without theater, extending his hand the way a man passes a tool he trusts another man to use well, and though he added gently that the decision was entirely Tabitha's, his eyes held the kind of approval that fortifies a promise rather than replacing it, and I felt something unclench where fear keeps its teeth. We spent the next morning letting Santa Fe be itself, streets that bend where they please, adobe that keeps its cool secrets, market stalls arguing color with the sky, and then set the buggy's nose toward Las Cruces, trading truths the way men do when the road holds them to a pace, his love for a wife gone too soon, and the way grief made scholars' halls colder until grandchildren warmed the idea of the West, my own losses and how work kept me from falling through the floorboards, his admission that he had arrived prepared to be skeptical and was leaving the city already wishing to be wrong, my confession that courage in a kitchen had taught me more than 10 seasons in the saddle had. We stopped at a rock that looks like a ship if you squint and let the horses breathe, and he asked what makes a home in a place this wide, and I said, people, only ever people, and the roof you choose to keep over the weather of your days. If she says yes, the ranch becomes ours. Truly, I promised myself as the land began to look familiar in the way a man loves. Landmarks walking out to meet us like dogs that remember. And when we crested the last rise, and the ranch threw its shape against the evening like a hand raised in greeting, she was already running, skirts hitched in one hand and the other raised, joy breaking over her face so clean and sudden a lesser man might have looked away out of respect for the nakedness of it. And I felt the ring in my pocket burn like a coal you do not drop because dropping would set the whole place alight. We drew the buggy to a stop, and she went to her father first, as is right, and they held each other like the end of hunger, And over her shoulder he looked at me with a nod that said, now, not to hurry, but to honor what time had brought us to. We carried the trunk inside and let the evening put its hands on all of us. The kitchen warm and smelling of something simple done right, the porch offering its usual counsel of stars. And when the house went still enough to hear your own pulse, I stood with her where the yard opens toward the dark and the cottonwoods make their slow music, the sky above us like a witness with no other business. And I asked her to walk with me a little so the ground could listen too. And the question I had rehearsed all the way to Santa Fe and back lined up behind my teeth with the discipline of a good crew at dawn. I was never this scared breaking a wild horse, and that is not swagger but confession, because a Mustang gives you the decency of showing its whites before it tries to remove you from your own spine, while this night offered only a porch held together by old nails, the steady grind of crickets measuring our courage, and a house that knew enough to help by sending Professor Winters to bed early with a book he has likely read 3 times already, the lamp in the front room dimming in a way that felt like consent. We stood where the boards sagged just enough to remind you wood has a memory, shoulder to shoulder at first, and then turned to face one another with the slow care of people who understand the damage clumsy movement can do. And I told her the truth in the order it learned to speak to me, that a house becomes a home when a person walks into it and the furniture remembers its purpose, that walls learn the sound of a voice they mean to keep, that a man who could once lift all his problems with a rope and a good knot had discovered the hunger of a different kind of needing, and that if she would let me finish before I lost my nerve, I could perhaps ask one question that would set every day after this one into a line. Neither of us would be obliged to march but might like to walk. I spoke of small things first because large things require scaffolding, of stew that taught patience and pages read aloud that taught listening, of mornings that began to arrive with coffee and not just chores, of the way her laugh makes the rafters answer and her silence makes the room hold its breath without fear, and then I let the larger things sit down among us without apology, that without her the ranch could be made to run but not to live, that she had placed her hands on the ordinary and made it holy by attention, that I had watched the men stand straighter without knowing they were doing it, and had caught myself expecting warmth at the end of day the way I once expected only dust. I told her I would fail at eloquence, and that she should forgive me my boots on this carpet of feeling, and I asked her to hear the intention even where the words fell short, because words do that sometimes when their load is heavier than their frame. The velvet box opened like a breath I had been holding since Santa Fe, the simple gold and single diamond steady under starlight, my question plain and complete, her tears scaring me for a blink, and then turning into the very word I needed. A yes, spoken with the strength of someone accustomed to choosing for herself. The porch took our weight without complaint, as I slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that have roped and hammered and stitched and somehow trembled more for a circle of gold than for a river in flood, and the kiss that followed did not feel like something borrowed from stories. It felt like work volunteered and accepted, a vow made with breath and answered in kind, and the laugh that broke through us mid-kiss came not from shyness but from relief, because 2 people can only carry a secret this size for so long before their ribs begin to creak. I told her I had loved her so long I could not find the start, even when I walked backward through the days like a man retracing a trail for a lost calf, that somewhere between burnt beans and willow bark, a line had been crossed so gently it left no tracks, and she put her forehead against mine in a way that stilled the worst of my pulse, and said she had been waiting for me to catch up to what she already knew. And if there was pride in that, it was the kind that makes a woman stand in a doorway and measure the weather before she lets it in. We stayed there a while in the soft dark, where words become fewer and truer, and when we finally stepped back across the threshold in search of a glass of water that might remember how to calm a body that has climbed a hill too fast, the kitchen contained exactly the right amount of coincidence in the shape of Professor Winters, who had happened into the room to look for a snack no man needs at that hour, his benign surprise convincing no one, and his eyes shining with the specific glint of a father who has just decided he can retire one worry permanently. He took her hands first and then mine, welcomed me to the family with a firmness that made the phrase feel like a standing structure rather than a sentiment, and the look he gave us over the rim of his spectacles said about time without the cruelty that sentence can sometimes carry, because patience wears better when it is not smug. We spoke quietly about practicalities because joy that intends to last asks for them. Papers to fetch, dates to set, dresses to alter, a church to ready, food to plan in quantities that would reassure a town eager to help, and in the middle of it I felt the promise that matters most arrange itself without the need for aisle or altar, that a wedding is a day and a marriage is the work, and if there is anything I know how to report for, it is work done shoulder to shoulder, season after season, failure used as instruction, success as encouragement, the ledger kept honestly so the year can bless you without choking on your exaggerations. We slept little and poorly for all the right reasons, the future noisy in the next room like cousins who have arrived early for a reunion, and when morning walked up the road sounding exactly like it always does, and yet like something new. The first bells from the church chased each other across the town with the eagerness of boys let out from chores. And it turned out that what we had told no one had somehow told everyone anyway, because joy leaks in places rumor can only dream of. By noon, the women in Las Cruces were already dividing responsibility as efficiently as a cavalry quartermaster, and the men were pretending to be surprised while quietly counting how many tables would fit under how many trees. Church bells will ring. The whole town already knows. 5 years later, our kitchen still smells like bread and courage. And if that seems like a boast, it is only because gratitude tends to dress up when it leaves the house, since the days have learned to lay themselves down in a pattern that holds. Even when the wind pushes, the ranch doubled not by luck but by long sums done at a rough table, and the kind of patience that sands its own splinters. The herd fat and slick under reins we did not beg for but did not waste, fencing straight where it needs to be and forgiving where the land asks for kindness. The house expanded board by board until it remembered it had always meant to hold more laughter. Jonathan, 3 and half going on questions without end, chases butterflies with the missionary zeal of a boy who believes color can be caught if only your feet tell your hands the right story. While little Eleanor sleeps against Tabitha's song as if notes were a quilt. And I stand in the doorway with coffee that has finally learned to taste like coffee and not like penance, and I understand with a simple completeness that we have become the life we hoped for, without noticing exactly when the hope turned into a habit and then into a home. Thomas rides in like he has always ridden in, dust announcing him before he finds his breath. And even from the porch I can tell the envelope he holds is not an ordinary one. The paper thicker, the seal deliberate, the handwriting so careful it pulls your shoulders back when you look at it. And when Tabitha opens it with the neatness of a woman who believes care is its own prayer, we learn what perhaps we had both wished for without daring to say, that Professor Winters is relocating to Santa Fe to be nearer us and the grandchildren who have colonized his heart, with a speed that would embarrass lesser armies. That the university there has asked him to bring his learning to a place still inventing its syllables, and that he has decided the trade between prestige and presence is not a trade at all, but a correction, like moving a fence to respect the truth of a boundary rather than the memory of a map. He writes with his particular dry warmth about libraries that will be smaller and more beloved for it, about classrooms that will be hungrier and therefore easier to feed well, about a little house with a garden he intends to make foolishly large, so Jonathan will have work to do whenever he finds his way to Santa Fe without his parents' permission, and midway through the page, in a sentence that made both of us sit down without planning to, he says, "Your courage in forging a path inspired me to choose my own." And I watched the words settle on Tabitha's face, like the exact weather that crop had needed. And I realized that what we think is a private choice is sometimes a lantern carried further than the road we can see. We gather ourselves around the news, the way a family gathers around a table the night a child tells a story that changes everyone's chore list, making plans that begin with soup and end with holidays, calculating the number of days between now and late summer when the wagons will bring him into Santa Fe for good, imagining the shelves he will fill and the children he will borrow and spoil and return with ink on their fingers and Greek in their ears, deciding which weekends the road will belong to us and which ones to him, adding a guest pillow to the list without thinking. And all the while, the kitchen keeps doing the job it was hired for years ago, making ordinary food into proof that love likes to eat. Evenings stretch longer now that there are more stories to set on the porch rail for airing, and we sit side by side and consider the chain of small mercies that brought us here, the way a Saturday morning turned on a burnt breakfast and a simple act of competence, the way a sentence spoken in a smoky room, "Move over, I'll stir the pot," grew like a sapling that refused to know it was fragile, the way the territory tested us with fever and pride and paper knives, and found it had made us sharper rather than brittle, the way work kept showing up with its hat in its hands asking to be done, and we kept answering yes because that is the only way any place becomes yours. We speak of fear without feeding it, of joy without breaking it, of plans without bullying them into outcomes. And sometimes we say nothing at all because silence, properly shared, is a kind of knowledge. When storms come, they do not ask for our calendar, and so we do what we have always done. Brace, tighten, check on neighbors, share what can be spared, learn what must be learned. And when good weather spreads itself out like cloth, we cut it carefully and sew it into something that will last past Sunday. There are hard days still, of course. Calves lost and tempers found, and a fence undone by a wind that must have been mad at someone else. But the ledger remains honest. We have more than we lack, and we have each other, and the work, which is to say the love, continues. The territory will keep testing us. We'll keep answering, with work, with wit, with the truth we chose, because there is no other answer that holds. Night lifts itself out of the arroyo and shakes the last dust from its mane, stars opening wider than seems decent, and then wider still as if to make room for a ranch that outgrew the first story we told about it. And inside the kitchen the fire settles into a red patience that means morning will not be ambushed. The pans clean and turned like coins, the bread resting under a cloth that never quite forgets the hands that taught it to rise. I take her hand, the one with the simple ring that has learned to carry flour and children and still throw light from time to time. And I think not in a grand speech, but in the exactness of a man doing math at a gate, that every day I am glad I said yes to learning. And to her, because it turns out those two yeses are the same words said to different teachers. We sit until coyotes speak their thin liturgy from far hills, and the air cools its voice for sleep, and the porch that heard our first vow of intention hears another, smaller and not less binding, that tomorrow, before the light has time to be fancy, the coffee will be ready and the work will begin, and the children will race it to the table, and we will keep laying down the simple bricks of a life that others will call strong, because we kept carrying them two at a time and never pretended they were feathers.